I'll be doing 4 things in this speech. Firstly, a little bit of setup. Secondly, on why this is good for peace. Thirdly, on why China is unlikely to overreact. And fourthly, on the economic benefits. So firstly, on setup. What countries do we think are likely to join? We think that countries that are likely to join are those who feel threatened by China or North Korea in the region. This means it would be countries beyond the Quad. This looks like South Korea, who would be threatened by North Korea, and South Korea do have a significant military. We think this is a benefit for us. This also looks like the Philippines. We'll do the proper debate. We will include Taiwan in this. Also countries like Indonesia, those sort of countries. Secondly, in what context is this alliance occurring within the Asia-Pacific? We think that currently there is rising tension within the Asia-Pacific. This looks like Japan and China having conflict over Senkaku Islands. This looks like the Korean Peninsula, where the war literally has not ended. Also just increased like Chinese threats towards Taiwan and general aggression there. Note, we think also currently a lot of these big countries are quite like agnostic towards these sort of issues and tensions. We see US having like strategic ambiguity. However, we think that in the status quo, this is fading already with China, with, for example, Biden saying that like the US will support Taiwan. So they're getting less and less ambiguous in that context. We think they're likely then to commit well to these sort of alliances in the region. Okay, why do we think that this pact is likely to be good for peace? We think, firstly, in general, across the region, including in the South China Sea, this will decrease the chance of military conflict, specifically for like small-scale conflicts, for example, conflicts over like boats in the South China Sea. Why is this? This is because currently in the status quo, attitudes towards like these small-scale conflicts are fairly like blasé, and that means there can be escalations of these sort of threats. Why is this? This is because China has quite a big military. The countries they're threatening generally do not, and they don't have those sort of strong alliances. Therefore, they're pretty like chill about escalating those conflicts when in fact it's over quite like a small issue. However, at the point at which you have other countries like having alliances and committing to those sort of conflicts, or knowing that the country could potentially have military backup from other larger countries, China's risk calculus will then change, right? Because there's now a significantly higher risk to engaging in these small-scale conflicts. This means they're more likely to then steer for these small-scale conflicts, things like diplomacy talk, rather than at like the first instance just going towards the military or being incredibly aggressive within the region. Secondly, on larger scale conflicts, for example, this looks like conflicts between South Korea and North Korea, where tensions have been there for many, many years. We think now, again, commitment to military action has significantly increased because the stakes have significantly increased. The point at which you want to attack a small country, you now have to engage with the US, Australia, India, South Korea, potentially all, that now have committed and very, very large armies and groups of people that can then back them up in that way. Because it's now a significantly larger commitment with multiple countries behind you, we think you're unlikely then to get into those sort of larger conflicts and have a lot of tensions within the region, because now you have to commit to a lot more countries. The risk calculus is just different. The economic cost is a lot larger, and it's going to impact you internally a lot more. You're then more likely to steer away from those conflicts. So clearly, there's less escalation of smaller conflicts and also larger scale conflicts. Okay then, why is China unlikely to overreact to this new pact? We think that 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, we think in the status quo, China is not in a particularly good position with Taiwan. We think that currently the conflict with Taiwan is all framed through like Chinese rhetoric and Xi Jinping constantly being like, we need to reunite with Taiwan to like feed into like nationalist sentiment. We can see this like particularly in post-COVID when the CCP has been fairly unstable. Now like Taiwan has more become like a political tool, right, for like to boost national sentiment and to create that feeling of being united. This importantly means that yes, while Taiwan may be a political goal for China, it's not necessarily a strategic goal for China at this point in time, especially after the devastation of COVID-19 and like sort of the economic impacts of that. So we think that clearly it's just like more of like a national and like narrative and sentiment thing rather than a strategic interest. This means that at the point at which China can now point to a change like strategic and security environment within the region, they can then pivot their goals vitally because it's now no longer like they can now like hide this political goal behind the, like their new strategic interest, being like, hey, we can't really do this anymore because it's probably not good for our nation because there's like now a changed environment. So that means that the CCP can pivot. We think they're likely to do that because they're quite strategic in the long term. Secondly, this is obviously going to be a losing war now because of all the mechanisms I told you before about how you just have to like fight so many more countries and engage like the military so much harder. This means that it's hard for China to retaliate against Taiwan in a meaningful way. Because if the CCP were to engage with Taiwan, potentially there could be short-term, like popular gains for like people on the ground in China and enjoying that. But in the long term or medium term even, it would be a losing position. There would be high amounts of deaths. It would be a high economic cost. We think CCP are a fairly rational actor in that way, and they will prioritise their long-term stability, given that they care about like the long term, and we think that that sort of thing that they can pull on. Also like historical rhetoric, right? For example, like, you know, Taiwan can like be like unresolved for thousands of years, and that's okay. We think that like the CCP could then pull on those like historical narratives in that way and see like, oh, like obviously it's a losing war, we're going to be strategic, we're not going to engage because we care long term about our image. Thirdly, we think that engaging in Taiwan and in like the Asia Pacific region now would be unpopular for many of the like powerful people within China. Why is this? This is because it's likely to be devastating for the economy at the point at which you have tons of countries in the region putting sanctions on you. Similarly, we think that countries in the region could potentially unite to, for example, strip like Chinese people of like their properties overseas, or potentially place higher taxes on them like this. This is devastating because if the like powerful group of people in China who are very, very rich, who are often bringing in a lot of FDI, who run companies overseas, who hold high positions within China, are running a lot of business, if they do not like these economic impacts of China engaging in Taiwan, they're likely to just leave China. And obviously that's a massive economic cost to China at the point at which they're not getting that money and they're not getting like that popular support, and they can't like hold those powerful people that are bringing the country together. Then it's devastating for them. They're no longer as likely to engage within Taiwan. Okay, new point here then. Why is it economically beneficial for the countries joining the pact? 4 mechanisms here. Look, the first thing to say, like, there's a bit of setup. Obviously, there's just going to be increased integration economically if you like join a pact. Like, that's sort of the definition. Okay. 4 things here. Firstly, we think in particular, larger countries will want to ensure stability within the region because of all the context I told you before. They do not want conflicts within the region. They want countries to be internally stable. This looks like funding a lot of aid into those countries. That's likely to increase, you know, like the livelihoods and the quality of living of people within these smaller and less developed countries. We think that's generally a good thing. We think that's helping people on the ground to be able to support. Secondly, we think that foreign companies are likely to invest within the region at the point at which it is more stable. If countries can now say, hey, look, I'm getting more aid, or hey, look, I have these other countries helping me out and wanting me to develop more, we think there's more certainty of like a good return on the investment. So we think that foreign companies are likely to come in, FDI is going to inflow, we think that's generally a net good. It would boost the economy of the countries within the region. Thirdly, we think in terms of it being an alliance, that necessarily means it's going to be army bases and like building that sort of infrastructure for the military. We think that's generally good because it employs people in the country. You're also getting infrastructure, things like roads, things like pipelines or like telephone poles, those sort of things that can help people on the ground again. It's not just military purpose, people on the ground can benefit from things like roads or new ports. Fourthly, just the nature of a pact is that you just get more trade. We think that's generally a good thing. It means that people can export more. You're supporting exporting economies. That is an economic benefit exclusive to our side under a pact. Because we don't think China is likely to retaliate in a meaningful way, because we think it helps the lives of people on the ground. So proud to affirm. Woo!
There are 2 things to this speech. Firstly, talking about why this is simply going to anger China and cause retaliation, and secondly, why it's simply an unnecessary pact. So firstly, in terms of how this angers China, the framing here is to say this pushes China to make serious actions that don't necessarily fully meet the requirements to actually start a war and engage with this pact itself, but necessarily also do harm the nations to which those actions occur. We're going to do 6 things to explain why this is necessarily going to anger China. Firstly, this is simply a threat to themselves as a regional power. They have, this can cause massive expansions on this issue of, they want to be a regional power, so they're likely to do far more to express their regional power in this area. Then secondly, it's simply, China cares a lot about having military supremacy. They care a lot about being the naval power. They have the largest coast guard within the South China Sea. So it is likely then they're going to use this and they're going to continue to push this because they wish to maintain their position as the military power in this region. They simply feel cornered in this area now that they're surrounded by Western influence and by Western military power. That is simply a threat which they will not stand by and do nothing against. Secondly, we think it is simply ideologically challenging to what they already have. This looks like internationally, they simply don't want to look weak. They want to look strong on the international stage. That does not not look like submitting. They've already shown themselves to want to establish themselves as a power. If they stand back now, they're looking weak, and that is something that they internationally do not want to be perceived as. But furthermore, simply domestically, they wish to maintain their legitimacy. So this was like when they have messages of wanting to take back Taiwan in an ideological basis, they're simply going to want to continue this. And they will see this as something that is getting in the way of those plans to retake Taiwan and establish one China. So in this way, it simply ideologically challenges them, and as a result, they're going to have to actually challenge the pact in and of itself. Thirdly, we think it is likely to ensure, likely to include a military build-up. See the way that NATO already occurs this doesn't necessarily have to be modeled in. This could simply be the fact that the US has incentives to create a military build-up in these countries, and as a result, that is simply going to cause a rise in tension in the same way that military build-ups in Europe cause a rise in tension in Russia. Furthermore, we simply think that these internally, military figures simply themselves don't want to look weak. So they don't want to stand down. They want to oppose this kind of threat that is occurring towards them because they want to rise the ranks within the CCP. Fifthly, we think that this explicitly is going to be framed as being anti-China, and China, when it has these messages that are against them, can't simply stand by and do nothing. They have to have some level of response to this if they wish to not look weak on the international stage. And then finally, we think this justifies China doing more actions, particularly the small countries that might not necessarily join. This is simply for the fact that they can say they are stopping the rising threat of this pact in the same way that Russia is able to justify lots of their actions by saying that they are opposing the rising threat of NATO. So in this way, we necessarily think this is going to anger China. So how does this ultimately impact the countries in the region? Well, this occurs in a couple of ways. First, we necessarily think that there's going to be simply like a lot of war and military action within the interim period. Noting here, the opposition can't simply instantaneously make everyone join this pact. This is going to happen over time. And in the period where people aren't currently joining this pact, China is going to attack them and it is going to try and establish power over them because they don't want those countries to join the pact for all the reasons I told you as to why it proves as a threat towards them. But secondly, we think that there will just be huge amounts of economic backlash. This looks at the fact that lots of them are entirely reliant on China and can't just switch all of a sudden to the US. They need this trade, and also note that China is hugely lending and is the largest lender in terms of like foreign aid and stuff to these places. So in this way, China is necessarily good for these countries, but also China can use this to have lots of leverage over these countries to make sure both that they might not necessarily join the pact in the first place, but to make sure that they would leave it or simply using this to like oppose countries that do. Noting here that China would also not want to do trade in these countries because that would simply be funding this opposing military and increasing the power of someone that is opposing them. But furthermore, all of this simply explains why why countries are unlikely to join this pact, and for those countries, it is going to be particularly bad. This is for the fact that China will then make huge amounts of pressure and huge military moves on these countries to establish power and stop them from possibly joining this pact in the future should they change their mind or should China lose its soft power in the region. So necessarily now, I'd like to quickly run through what the opposition has at this point. And this is what they said in the fact that they won't overreact. This is that they said Taiwan is only a political goal. Noting it is not just a political goal, but it is an ideological basis. This idea that there was one China, this is something that people actually believe within China. But furthermore, we think they can the idea that they can avoid it and say, oh, but this strategic goal makes it not doable. This is simply conceding that the CCTV would say that they are weak to their own people. We think that is extraordinarily unlikely. When they say that there are huge economic harms to China, such as sanctions, there are huge economic harms to literally every country in the Asia-Pacific region should they anger China. We think this is not the balance that goes. The balance of power is against the other countries in the region, not against China. Furthermore, we think the opposition's claims that the chance of conflict, in terms of particularly small things, in terms of the fact that China escalates as the power balance is in their favour, and that now they're all of a sudden favour diplomacy first, but often China does go for diplomacy first. We see this with all of the lending that they do and all of the foreign aid that they give to these countries. They are big into soft power, as I'm about to go into. In this fact, is now the second issue about how this is just simply an unnecessary pact. This is the reason that China is simply unlikely to invade these countries. It is not their first priority. They have several other ways in which they can institute their power. This is the fact that their foreign policy is often simply based on having soft power and low-scale military moves, like spying and other things like that. And it is not actually invading people. So this is currently effective, and they don't actually need to start a war and do any serious military intervention. So as a result, this is simply not needed under the opposition side. But furthermore, we simply think that any kind of invasion seems extraordinarily hypocritical to the ideological basis on which they spread within the country. This is the fact that they oppose US interventionism due to things like 100 years of humiliation, where they despise interventionism, they despise colonialism, and they wish to oppose it in all of its forms. They themselves also wish to not engage in this. This is why they only do things like the BRI and lending and other things like that, and don't actually do this kind of military action. Noting here that all of these things change as soon as other issues are able to take their place. This looks like the fact that while they do care about not being interventionist, at the point where they see a serious military threat, they will begin to care about being interventionist because they see it as a direct threat to their power in the region. That is something they care more about So in this way, necessarily, we think this is simply an unnecessary treaty. It will cause far more harm to the region than it would good, because it simply doesn't actually have the kind of benefits the opposition talk about. Now I'd like to quickly touch on the opposition's claims about the economic benefits they will see. And this is things like the fact that large countries want to keep stability and aid like given, or I think it's simply symmetric to the fact that China also would like stability in these regions, and is already giving them lots of foreign aid and other things like that to establish its stability. But furthermore, their claims that now furthermore, just this overall point falls down to the fact that the large majority of economic trade in this area comes from China and to China, and at the point where you anger China, China has the capacity, China has the economic strength to simply cut off these nations. China has the ability to use this huge amount of leverage over them. This is going to cause simply so many economic harms to this region that is going to cause far more death than any sort of small military situation now. Because the only real harm that the opposition thought about what China is doing is them attacking boats in the South China Sea. That is an extraordinarily small thing compared to economic disaster within the Asian Pacific region. We think that is a huge harm that the opposition is going to have to bear in this debate, and they simply can't outweigh it by saying, oh, now China doesn't run past a boat, doesn't speed past and buzz a boat in the South China Sea. We naturally think that there is a particularly small harm compared to anything else in this debate. So at the end of this speech, what should you believe? You should believe that China is ultimately going to be particularly threatened by this move. They're going to in turn have particular military action in the interim period. They're going to cause huge amounts of economic harm against the people that join this pact, and force people not to join this pact using the threat of that economic harm. And as a result, they're going to cause huge harms to anyone that is, and then they're also going to take over anyone that doesn't. But furthermore, we simply think that all of this is an unnecessary fact. And at the end of that, you clearly believe the negative. Thank you.
The first thing I want to deal with is the main benefit that opposition brings you in this debate, which is that essentially they claim that, well, you can decrease the sort of chance of some sort of small-scale conflicts that have been undertaken by China because of this. I would note four main problems with this. Firstly, I would point that there's a massively high barrier to activation at the point at which you actually are engaging in the mutual defence treaties, which is to say that most of the sort of small-scale conflicts that they want to prevent are not meaningful casus belli that would engage the sort of whole network of the mutual defence treaty, and that would mean that other countries would be willing to step in and go to war for you. And China knows that, which is why it's quite easy for them to continue doing the sorts of engagements that they want to talk about. Because obviously you don't go to war over the type of things that they want to talk about. You don't go to war over soft power exertion or the BRI. That is obviously not what the debate is about. But secondly, I just point to the fact that China has often been willing to engage in small-scale conflicts and things that would risk large-scale conflicts, even with very big powers. For example, the border skirmishes that China has engaged with India show that they're willing to obviously risk that sort of calculus, even in the scenario where obviously a war with India would be sufficiently devastating for China for the same deterrence mechanism that they want to point to apply, but China is willing to do it anyway because they know that countries are not willing to risk some sort of conflict over this because it would be equally devastating for them as for China. But thirdly, I would just point out that this agreement is effectively paralysed without America, which explains that you're only likely to sort of intervene in instances where it is beneficial to America to sort of intervene and to protect people. And this is a massive harm in this debate because countries are now going to be extremely reliant on this agreement for their defence, and in a scenario where it is not, the other countries in the agreement do not see it as sort of sufficiently important for them to step in and for them to risk their military, these countries will be left lacking because they will be left without the support. Obviously, it would be quite easy for America to sort of, abandon the agreement in that circumstance. But the fourth thing I would point to is just the fact that this is very harmful to sort of other, more effective methods of containing China or restricting their behaviour. Because it means you cannot no longer do things like strengthen diplomatic ties with China, increase the exchange and flow of people between your nation, increase the economic integration between your two nations, which are the types of things that do actually meaningfully increase the deterrent to China's behaviour, because for all of the reasons that they explain, China is unlikely to engage in these nations if it's extremely sort of economically devastating or unpopular within China. All of those sorts of methods of deterrence are lost under their side when China is much less willing to engage in this. Secondly though, I do want to just talk about why it is very likely that China will react very poorly to this. Because their main response to a lot of our material here is, well, things like Taiwan are some purely rhetorical. No, obviously not. This is the 70-year founding myth of the Chinese Communist Party. It is literally written into Chinese law that they have to engage and they have to retake China at some point. They were willing to shoot missiles over the Taiwan Strait just because Nancy Pelosi visited. Obviously, this is not purely rhetorical or purely flexible. Their claim here is, well, China has control over the narrative in China. Obviously, they do not have brain control over their citizens. The average Chinese person does care deeply about Taiwan in the same way that the average American person cares deeply about things like, the founding of America and America's history. In that sense, that is the equivalent in China. That is obviously something that people care about a lot, and it is ideologically important to a lot of Chinese people. But secondly, do also just look the second mechanism here is, well, you can leverage the excuse of this as a reason, the excuse of this agreement as the reason you are abandoning Taiwan. Obviously, that is an extremely weak thing to do, and it runs extremely contrary to a lot of the narratives that are important to China's legitimacy. Obviously, they will not back down over this thing. But the sort of second thing they say, well, in every other instance, the sort of incentives for China are only sort of rational and sort of geostrategic. But I point out to the fact that a lot of their mechanisms for deterrence are not very effective. Because the first thing that we point to is there is just an interim period in which, before this agreement activates or before you have the time to do the military build-up, where all of the incentives that we point to apply, but none of their deterrence mechanisms apply. That is a scenario where China is going to be hugely incentivized to act, much more so than there would be in our world, because there is now a time pressure and they feel the urgency of taking this action. But other things like suggesting well, China's weak because of COVID, isn't obviously a very short-term thing, but also China is just recovering extremely well. And all of this is to explain that, and also this particularly relies, thirdly, on an extremely sort of rational conception of China's decision making. But world mechanization explains why that is not the case, because the individual decision makers who are deciding, when to go to war, the planners who are writing the military reports, aren't necessarily thinking about the sort of best geostrategic rational thing in general. They think about what is best for them to suggest, and if they want to get promoted, they need to buy into these narratives of Chinese expansionism and nationalism, and that is why when it gets filtered up to the top, it is extremely likely that China will react very badly. What are the sort of military impacts of this on the countries in Asia? The first thing I would note is to deal with the set of countries who do not join the agreement. We say that there are many good reasons why they wouldn't. For example, all the material about China will be angry. But secondly, also a lot of them do just have a strong history of supporting neutrality and supporting, and supporting pacifism. Thirdly, I would point out a lot of them are former colonial states. Obviously, Vietnam would be, for example, very unlikely to have a whole bunch of Western bases in their states. Consider China's incentives in these cases, because China is obviously going to work extremely hard to pull these countries into the circle, to be more assertive and be more exploitative with them. That looks like things like economic control, but it looks like things just China creating a similar set of agreements or a similar expansion of its military, setting up military bases in these countries. That is obviously hugely damaging, and they now have the ability to sort of leverage the rhetoric of, well, now America is controlling the Asia Pacific, which is obviously something a lot of these countries do not want for the reasons that I've already explained. But then, secondly, for their better scenario, are the set of countries who do join. As we point out, there is an extremely devastating interim period. This looks like North Korea trying to be particularly aggressive with South Korea before they have more build-up. It looks like other countries. It looks like China doing more skirmishes and more economic control in an interim. But it also, I would just explain that other sorts of means of exerting their power are just worse, because if their best claim is, well, you can stop the small scale naval expedition into an exclusive economic zone, that's not a really big benefit. But the types of sort of more intense things that China is now incentivized to do, such as intensifying their sort of spying operations or increasing some sort of economic thing, are actually much more devastating and affecting people much more. That is the last thing I want to deal with, which is the economic impact of this policy. This is the most certain benefit that either team can bring you in this debate, and I think we're very far ahead here. Their main response to a lot of our material is to say, well, China would never leverage economic power so grossly because it would be too harmful to itself. But China is obviously, first of all, clearly empirically willing to do that. For example, they have done this historically. They were willing to impose devastating barley tariffs on Australia. They were obviously much more damaging to Australia than it was to China. And the particular capacity to do this is the fact that different countries have sort of different goods, which means that they export, which means it's difficult for them to sort of combine their powers to damage China. But also we have to point to the fact that China is a net exporter, it has the biggest workforce in the world, it has just a lot of economic power, it's easy to generate public willingness. It's obviously true that they can do this. I just lastly point to the fact that there are many economic harms of these agreements. Obviously, in the same way that if you're part of NATO, you have to spend money on your military. That is obviously very bad for these sort of powers, who are often poor, who are now having to sort of increase their military spending. But I just, secondly, point to the fact that American economic influence is just a harm, because they say America's incentive is to create stability. This looks like things like America forcing loan agreements on these countries, which are literally just as predatory as the BI. It looks like forcing increasing reliance on the dollar onto these people. That is obviously something that is extremely damaging. But then, I just point out, China is the biggest provider of aid to a lot of these nations. China is the pillar of their economies, and that is something that they relinquish on their side. That kills people. That means people pay more for food. That is extremely damaging for every part of the UK.
I'm going to start with the benefits that we give you about development. This is, I think, very important in this debate, because even if you believe that we lose on stuff that China is going to invade, all their mechanisms for that making any sense are all things that exist in the status quo as well. Like, this is China's founding myth, that it's literally written in their law that they have to invade Taiwan, which kind of implies that that's going to happen in either world. So if you believe any of that mechanization, you should care about the number of people who are likely to be positively affected by this agreement taking into case. This is an impetus on its own. There's stuff about, oh, well, China gives them the most aid currently. It's just like not actually a preferable version of the world, right? As Dhruv points out to you, the only reason that occurs in the status quo is because of the lack of consistent US engagement or other aid from countries in the region, because they don't have as much of an interest in it. One country having a huge power and economically coercing you to do as it wishes is obviously also a harm that gives China the ability to get what it wants in these countries to a similar or perhaps even greater degree than on the outside of the house. What sort of development benefits are there in this debate? Firstly, these countries actually get useful infrastructure. This is incredibly important to note, because a lot of the way the BRI operates is vanity projects for leaders of countries that end up having very little use to their individual citizens. And of course, the infrastructure is likely to be relatively military-based, but it does look at things like usable roads and upgrades to facilities that don't exist in the status quo. Secondly, and very importantly, is you get a lot of aid for internal stability. The reason why this doesn't happen in the status quo is because countries are not super concerned with what the impact is of like internal instability in a country, like outside of their own immediate region, or it's relatively small. But now that you're involved in actively supporting them military-wise, you likely have a clause in the agreement that talks about, stabilizing internal conflicts and stuff like that. You have an incentive to ensure those don't occur in the first place, so that you don't have to intervene. Thirdly, and quite importantly, you also just get a bunch of leverage over countries. So in the context where the Philippines have had several issues with backsliding democracies in certain instances, being able to weaponize the fact that the Philippines is incredibly concerned about the South China Sea gives you an opportunity to increase democracy and increase engagement between these other countries. Obviously, as well, the US has an incentive for all of these countries to develop their military infrastructure, and they say that might not be good, spending a lot of money on the military is bad. These countries are scared shitless about the potential for North Korea or China in the region in the status quo. They are spending money on their military already. Having US, Australian, and Indian involvement makes it more efficient spending on their military because they get access to better materials, so obviously that's much preferable. So, winning the debate on development alone. Secondly, on Pitt. Why the joining stuff isn't an issue? I think it's very reasonable for us to say the agreement will be announced and then taken into effect immediately. It's also just kind of interesting to note that, AUKUS was announced 2 years ago, right? Similar kind of situation where you have greater encroachment over China. The reason why it hasn't taken action against Taiwan now is because, it's unlikely to do so anyway, but I think it's just quite analogous there. It's also just very important to note that it's just not analogous with Russia talking about NATO, right? As Dhruv points out, the issue with Ukraine and why it was invaded is because it wanted to be part of NATO and NATO wouldn't have it. The comparative here is that these countries are likely to want to be part of the security agreement and they want to have them back. Notably as well, Russia doesn't invade Belarus because Belarus is already pretty ideologically aligned with Russia, similarly with Kazakhstan because they're all part of the CSTO. So this is probably pretty analogous to Vietnam in these circumstances. To the extent that it didn't want to join the agreement, it's unlikely that China is actually likely to act punitively towards it, particularly because that would decrease its economic benefit. To the extent that China is now purportedly going to all these economic sanctions, you probably want to have your friends and your stable friends where you can find them, so they're unlikely to be negative towards this. Notably, a lot of countries probably do want to join this agreement though, right? The issues of the South China Sea, the East China Sea, are very crucial to many of these countries and perceived as pretty existential threats. But also, because China has been doing things like debt trap diplomacy, not soft power, like economic coercion through the Belt and Road Initiative, it does make them fearful and they want to be able to join with the US. But the US in particular has been pretty iffy on terms of its commitment to the Asia-Pacific recently because of changes in administration and stuff like that, which means I think they're likely to jump at the opportunity to engage the US in the long term. Note though, I don't think the US abandoning this pact is like within the debate. We have the fear as the Quad to do this, which I think means it's likely to be successful, and the argument is out of it. So, is there an impetus here, right? Because notably, all of this stuff about the ideological commitment that China has to wanting to invade Taiwan and stuff like that, presumably just also exists under their status quo in their side of the house, right? All the rhetoric that's being amped up and the things that are in law are meaningful for China right now. And very notably is like, well, they say, oh, well, China doesn't want to be hypocritical. China avoids hypocrisy, but it's so important when they're being encroached in. But they just actually ignore what the security environment in the Pacific is in the status quo, which is there are a large amount of bilateral agreements within countries specifically designed to stop the spread of China. Like, it's been worried about encirclement and encroachment in the past. Even AUKUS is an example of that as well. Biden slipping up and saying that the US would support Taiwan is another example of where this is becoming more and more clear. The problem is it's ineffective in the status quo because they don't all operate together. There is very little clarity as to what is actually occurring, which means you have room in the dark for mistakes to be made, for small errors to slip up that end up escalating into massive conflicts, because like China does something in Taiwan and accidentally crosses one of the US's red lines, or vice versa with the US and Taiwan. You know, they send a president there and China decides this is the time to invade. Much, much better to have clearer distinctions about where what you actually believe in the status quo. Also, the small stuff, the small conflict stuff is incredibly important, right? China and India have been having border clashes for decades. And these things can just escalate really quickly, right? Like, you know, to the extent that it doesn't seem very important because there's never going to be a war about this issue, at the point at which you have a security pact with a clear statement in it that, for example, if a death occurs as a result of the hands of another army, then this is where it occurs into play. You now have considerable more consideration before you actually occur on an individual level because you don't want to have this escalate into the future. The small conflict stuff is relatively important there as well because it can result in death and conflict. Finally though, is China going to react badly? I want to think about the more reasonable thing first, which is this idea of economic sanctions, right? The reason why China can sanction Australia's Bali is because Australia is one country, a relatively smaller economy, and very far away where it has alternative ways to get Bali. They're literally talking about sanctioning their entire immediate geographic region, many of whom they export their own goods to, and get paid for, right? So it obviously economically cripples China to do this to the extent that none of these countries are then going to accept your exports, and you now cannot import anything from them before. And yes, maybe China can get alternative imports elsewhere, but notably much further away, so it's going to cripple their economy. Like, you know, China is going to sanction India and the US, the two biggest economy in the world, the other biggest country in the world. It just seems absolutely nonsensical, unlikely to do that in the same way that it does in status quo. That's why it didn't sanction the US for AUKUS. Secondly though, is China going to fight? The argument is just here, oh, well, they really ideologically care about this, right? So they're going to have a temper tantrum. In the status quo, they are shooting missiles, right? In the status quo, you are having this form of escalation, which means that it's actually probably pretty important to know that what's going on right now is not sufficient to actually counter any of these things. But notably as well, China has backed away from nationalism in the past. They did it in 2012 when there were huge nationalist protests against Japan's actions in the Senkaku Islands. You know what China did? They suppressed those protests. They said in the media that they had changed their perspective on the issue, and they're able to do similar things here because they have a huge amount of media control, because the CCP has had varied perspectives towards Taiwan in the past, including Deng Xiaoping saying it doesn't matter if it's not solved for fucking 1,000 years, it can just exist for that time. China can back away from things, and Dhruv explains why they have the power to, but also, very importantly, they just never actually explain why ideology is so important, right? Like, even if you have people in China saying they care, they don't explain why that actually changes the CCP's impetus to do anything. Like, huge protests in China has never changed anything in the past meaningfully. But we tell you as well, the long term of the stability of the CCP is threatened because this war is a losing one, right? If you retaliate militarily against Taiwan, you then draw in all these other countries that have combined a bigger military than China's. You're likely to have a huge amount of Chinese deaths that ultimately result in the CCP being even more unpopular, and also particularly unpopular economically with people who are hugely economically powerful. You end up with huge amounts of sanctions that you don't get otherwise. Obviously, this means the costs for China are so much greater than they are in the status quo, but it's very unclear whether or not the US is ever going to intervene in the first place because those commitments are wishy-washy and unstable. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the cost of this is so limited because in the status quo there is already an impetus, there is already a reason to worry about this, so proud to propose.
Two questions I'm going to answer in this speech. First, what does this pact look like? And second, how we're trying to react to this. Starting off with the first question, what does this pact actually look like? There are three parts to this. First thing I'm going to explain is when does this pact actually enact and when does this agreement actually take place? Because this opposition seems to think that this agreement will take place like literally from the BRI, which is incredibly unlikely for the simple reason that it's very hard to prove that it is like, for a lot of these countries which actually do agree to this investment, that is necessarily something that is on net bad. But I would also note that there are other countries which will be part of this agreement that they talk about, who actually do care about that investment. So it's unlikely that you trigger a war over this in the first place. But the second thing that would say that if this opposition does force them to engage in a war, literally over the BRI, we would say that that is actually just an unnecessary war, which has enormous conflict, and would be something that is just on net bad because of how many deaths you have. They sort of say, well, the BRI is incredibly predatory. Three things to say. Firstly, often this is comparative to no investment at all in the region. Secondly, it's unexplained why the US is any less predatory. We think that in fact the US would like to be more predatory for the reasons that they're likely to do things like take your oil and gas because they don't invest in interest in that region, because they're more likely to just take that and bring it home, in comparison to China, which cares about the regional stability, which the US does not as much. But the final thing that we point out here is that China is not doing as many predatory loans, because obviously it wants to build up those places of infrastructure such that it can use it for trade hubs, etc., which are actually a benefit. All of that is to explain that this agreement does not take place and it will not be enacted in the circumstances that they sort of say, which is literally the BRI, something that is happening like right now. And if it was the case that the US was willing to invade over that, then it was something that would be already happening, which we obviously know is not the case. Second part of this question then is to talk about the larger scale conflict. Do they actually stop any of the larger scale conflict? They're unlikely to stop the larger scale conflict they talk about for a number of reasons. Firstly, because as they sort of say, other agreements do exist, like the Japan and US agreement. So it's unlikely that they go and invade one of the countries when those strategic pacts are already intervened. And I know that this pact specifically is the one that is the tipping point. Because as we point out, we say that China, this is a pact that is specifically aimed against China, the same way that NATO is aimed against Russia. And so we would say that this specifically is the reason is the problem. But the second thing that we point out is that they're unlikely to conduct the actual full-scale military conflict, because we've seen the success of like Ukraine defending against Russia, etc. And we point out to things like the porcupine strategy, which is generally pretty successful, and explain why the larger scale forms of military conflict, which are the only things that this opposition can try and claim fall out of this debate. Final thing that we point out is that there's obviously less risky forms of expansion, like the BRI, which means that under our side, they'll continue being able to do this, but they don't have to lose face as they do on the opposition side, where they would have to force them to concede and back down. That obviously means that the larger scale conflict is obviously more likely under their side, whereas under the status quo, they have no additional benefit towards us. The third and final part of this issue is to talk about the construction of this pact. And this notably gets insufficient response from this opposition. Because we explained that by nature, A, not every country will want to join this pact, and B, not every country which will want to join this pact in the future will join now. And that is devastating, and that's for four reasons as we go down the bench. And firstly, because we point out that it's a necessary interim period that exists. But secondly, because of features like colonialism, which means that a lot of these countries don't necessarily like the US or the West. But thirdly, we would note that these are often highly political. And to the extent that this opposition tries to like fiat sanctions in on this debate, that is the exact reason why a lot of countries won't want to join under their side. And the final thing that we would point out is that there are, as they also admit, there are often a lot of these countries which have large amounts of Chinese diasporas in them, which necessarily means that it's unlikely they get a large swathe of countries to join. Why is that devastating, and why does that lose them the debate? Because to the extent there is a large amount of countries which do not join, it is in China's direct incentive to inflict the worst harms upon them. It is China's direct incentive to dissuade them, to strike fear into their hearts, and make sure that they do not take any more action. Which is exactly why there's a large set of countries that this opposition just leaves helpless. A large set of countries which want to retain strategic ambiguity, but because of it, are much more likely to come at the very worst harms that we point out in a way that is particularly destructive. So, what you know so far is that this is unlikely to trigger over the BRI, but the very worst scales of conflict that they're trying to stop under their side, symmetric, so it's unlikely to happen under our side. But what they do leave hanging is the vast amount of countries, or many countries, which simply do not join, but do rely on China and necessarily come at the cost of this agreement. So, second question in this debate is how will China react to this? And this is the easiest way for us to win the debate, because it explains why the biggest harms that we talk about do actually come to fruition. They've got a number of responses. First thing that they say is just, well, China's kind of unstable because of COVID. Obviously, they've bounced back from COVID, even if that's not true, that is a short-term reason. We would say that long-term, this is a reason they will continue to be particularly aggressive. Second line of attack they say is, well, China's own is ideological, and no other countries are ideological. I would note that the ideology of China is that they are the hegemon, which necessarily means that it is necessary for them to keep consuming power. Or even if that's not their ideology, that's how they want to be perceived. And that is exactly why they're often willing to cut off their nose for short-term harm if that brings them long-term reputation and brings them a long-term, they're known as an actor that is unwilling to back down because that's what gives them leverage. Second response is that we would note that you still need to act in order to sway future activity. So China doesn't act now. They know that that the West is only going to encroach more upon this region, and it is necessary for them to dissuade countries to continue joining these sorts of agreements, which is exactly why China will react particularly harshly. Second line of attack that they have here is to say, well, the elites will be annoyed because there will be economic hardship for China. There are 4 problems with this argument. First problem with this argument is that we just point out that China is just an enormous economic player. And it's not within opposition's sphere to just say they will just like have all these countries sanction China. And we would just note that if that is the case, then it would just be incredibly unpopular, which as I explained is the reason why a lot of countries just won't join because they do rely on China. But the second thing that I'd say about this argument is that it's reliant on all the countries, just literally the whole Asian region, just not being willing to trade with China, which is probably pretty unlikely for the reasons that we've stated. But the third problem with this argument is that even if this is true, we would just point out that China is just likely to supplement this by being more aggressive. So even if you lose economically, it's more likely that you do things like you take land for all the reasons that we point out, which is actually a harm in this debate. Fourth problem with this argument is that even where economic hardship exists, that's not a reason why China will back down. Yes, China does care about their economy, but we would note that specifically, China has, and we know empirically, has been willing in the past to cut off their nose in order to sort of seem legitimate, even if they are not sanctioning other countries and not trading with them, even if they put tariffs that is enormously destructive to people who cannot afford food, cannot afford manufacturing. That is a harm this opposition must call. Final line of attack that they seem to say that they sort of have this vision that you can just shift all the economy to the West, and you will just move it away from China. There are a number of reasons why you can't do that, and that is destructive, because even if they can do that in the long run, we would put in the short run, for the 5 years or the 10 years that it takes to shift along your economy, that is incredibly devastating to those people. It's devastating to the people who now have to pay more money because they have to travel more distance for the trade. It's devastating to the people who have to set up new supply lines and take down those businesses. It hurts people, and I'll note that you can't just supplement the Chinese economy, because there are obviously different economic gaps between the US and China, which necessarily means that you can't just plug that gap with another country, which means that this opposition is losing out on the vast majority of trade for a lot of countries, which do in fact rely on China. The final thing that I'll point out in this speech is that this opposition just harms a lot of countries from protection, which is to say that you simply harm the countries up to military conflict. There is a whole lot of harm, like the economic destruction. And even if it's not explicit, we will point out that it's implicit harm, which is that China just cares about you less in general, which means that even if China doesn't explicitly hurt you, they're less likely to care about your interests in sort of agreements. You're more likely to do things like justify its own actions, which means that it can be more aggressive in the worst ways. At the end of the speech, what do you know? China will act aggressively. There is no benefit of this agreement, so Brad proposed.
Thank you, Rush, for that speech. We now move to the reply portion of the debate, where speaking times are hard and the speaking order reversed. I'd therefore like to invite the negative reply up to conclude the negative case. Here.
Real flaw in this opposition's case is simply the existence of the passage of time, because nothing can really happen instantaneously. At the point where it doesn't, China has room to do things like military action, has room to do things like sanctions without any form of repercussion, because this pact is not in place yet. So on that, I'd like to begin talking about this interim period where the pact does not yet exist, but it is known about, because it is very hard to keep a secret between several nations. Noting here that China has intelligence circles, does have spies and things like that, and we'll find out. You can't simply keep this a secret and make it happen instantaneously. You have fiat over the Quad, but not necessarily over the rest of the region. So now on that, what we tell you here is there is simply no threat of military or economic backlash against China in this period, aside from what might already exist. But all of the material we give you as to why China has huge amounts of incentives to stop being, to maintain their regional power, do not feel threatened by the US coming in and taking out other nations. All of those incentives do exist and do pressure them to take direct action, do pressure them to take military action, do pressure them to take economic action against these countries, to pressure them not to join this pact and to stay with China. And all of those things are there to say that this will cause huge amounts of trauma in the short term to all of these countries. At that point, the opposition has to prove such huge, ginormous benefits. They have to prove essentially that China would invade these countries without this pact, and that they would have huge economic benefits if they moved to the US all of a sudden. So on that, the opposition's responses to this claim was simply to say that no, we have fear to make this instantaneous. As I told you, they do not. They have fear to make the Quad do things, but necessarily you have regions, you have countries that have to think this over. They can't instantly be like, oh yep, I'll join as soon as they're asked. Then furthermore, the opposition claim this happens in either world. Yes, that might be true for Taiwan, but not necessarily for everywhere else in the Asia-Pacific region, because China doesn't have those same incentives there. But furthermore, they claim, oh, we have AUKUS and things like that didn't necessarily have the same response. Notably, AUKUS didn't include Taiwan and other huge players in the region that were directly next to China. We think this is a particularly different example to island nations that are particularly far away from China in comparison. So, and then furthermore, we think that this is simply, as we told you, is directly aimed at China itself, and is therefore far more likely to invoke a response compared to AUKUS. So, at the end of that, this is just a huge benefit that we achieved this debate. This is avoiding war, this is avoiding military action. This isn't simply buzzing around boats in the South China Sea. This is actually taking action against countries. This is putting huge sanctions on them. So ultimately, and the opposition response to say, oh, but then you get like sanctions back and this will hurt China as well. Obviously, China can take it far more than the Philippines can. I think that is quite intuitively true. So now, what happens after this interim period, when pretty much every country in the Asia-Pacific region gets fucked over? That is going to be talking about people who join this pact, and then necessarily people who don't. So firstly, on people who join the pact, because this is where this debate talks about most. So what we necessarily told you is there are going to be huge economic harms that happen to these countries. This looks like huge amounts of sanctions from China. As the opposition responded, they said that there are huge, this like causes harms to China, and this hurts China as well. Obviously, it hurts it to a symmetrically different extent. This isn't, it's like symmetric in an even way. Necessarily, they have done this before. They're also far more willing to take this. They're a large country, they have a large economy that can take the brute force of this. We told you this from first. Furthermore, the opposition claimed that the US will simply give economic aid and give this economic trade in place of China. But again, we tell you, in the interim period, this is not able to happen. You can't instantly change supply chains like this. Furthermore, we don't necessarily think this is as good as the opposition claim. The US is particularly predatory. They don't have the incentives like China does to not seem like being an interventionist power. They have incentives to benefit themselves. Furthermore, we necessarily told you that this is also just simply long-term costly for people, because moving trade from China to the US also includes just having huge amounts of distance that is now added, that adds cost for these people. Noting here that these are like likely developing nations that they can't take the brunt of this extra cost that is now placed on their trade. So at the end of that, there is just huge amounts of economic harm that are placed on these countries that the opposition can't simply overcome. The opposition's attempt to overcome this was to say that they get economic strength from the US. But obviously this is actually, as we told you, really bad and predatory. And then for the people who don't, they simply get far more investment from China economically and militarily in terms of controlling the region. And for those reasons, you vote science.
Hi everyone, thank you all very much for the debate. I thought it was quite a close and quite well done debate by both sides. I'll go through some general feedback, result, reasons for the result. In terms of general feedback, the first thing I think is at times this debate relies too heavily on analogies of like comparing this to Russia, Ukraine, NATO, etc., without explaining why the incentives or situation is analogous enough that China would act in the same way to this. So I think analogies are useful starting points. Obviously, it's a debate whether the body itself is an analogy to something else, but actually stepping through why that is likely to occur in this scenario as well. I think the second thing is the debate could focus a bit more on what is mutually exclusive and what is symmetric around some of these incentives and how China would operate. I think for a good example here is just like the incentives of China to engage in military action on either side. Like a lot of the reasons teams gave seem to seem like it'd be unlikely to engage in military action on either side because of all the harms of war, etc., and existing USA commitments. So I think teams will focus on what is the actual additive benefit of this additional thing, whether or not that makes a significant change and why that change exists, or why that change wouldn't make any change. So try to think about what actually changes and doesn't change from status quo as a consequence of this. And lastly, I think just with the nature of the body itself, I think explaining a bit more, like there is probably a lot more that can be done about who and why certain countries would join this body, and also certain actions this body would take. Like would it just purely be a military defence pact? Would it be a body that does a bunch of economic engagement as well? And why those things are likely to happen? I think would have helped teams to characterise what this body does and why it's good or bad. In terms of the results, then, it was quite a close debate. Ultimately narrowly awarded the side negative. Congratulations. Three broad questions then. The first question is just an assessment of the status quo and how threatening China is at the moment, and what are the risk factors facing China at the moment, and whether or not it is likely to engage in military action. I think the first thing to note, so I think this is just important then, because it just sets up how necessary this body is and how much additional benefit this body adds to fixing the issues that China faces at the moment. So on the first question, whether it's actually likely to be threatening war or conflict or bigger issues, I think there's a huge back and forth on whether or not how likely they are to invade Taiwan here. But I think that probably comes a bit more later in the EOA. I think the first thing I know here is that what needs to point out is that China, in lots of cases, hasn't opted for military action in response to other pacts that already exist, and also doesn't really engage in significant military action for all the reasons that both sides claim. That's why military action would be particularly bad. Secondly, I think Nega's able to point out that China has a lot of other alternatives that don't require military action to achieve the goals it wants politically and economically. So it looks like things like the Belt and Road, it looks like things like soft power, economic power, which means they can achieve the benefits they want of controlling the regional power, etc., without having to have the risk of ongoing armed conflict, and thirdly, just the general harms of war. So I think what that does is, in terms of the China threat of like significant military action at the moment, makes it a lot smaller. Where I think China is still doing actions at the moment that obviously could be bad, things like the soft power and the way it operates and influences countries in the regions you may not like, but don't necessarily, and like that's sort of like the fiddling around in the South China Sea and attacking boats and things like that, but not things that escalate to full-on invasion or armed conflict. So the second question then about how will China respond to this body existing becomes important with relative to what China is doing at the moment and how much threat that is. So the big thing that AF pushes here is that there'll likely be a bigger deterrence impact, because now China's having to face bigger armies and bigger military powers, so therefore won't engage in harmful acts. With less more deterrence from them engaging in military action things going forward. I think on the first level of these big armed conflicts, I think as I detailed earlier, I'm actually not convinced there'll be a significant amount of change in China's willingness or unwillingness to engage in armed conflict. And this, I think, probably hurts both teams in today's debate, because it does reduce, I think, the bit of the imperative from affirmative, but it also does reduce a bunch of the harms from negative. Obviously, make China more likely to invade militarily, because all the reasons teams talk about are not going to engage in conflict and there being threats already probably mean there isn't a large amount to happen. I think there's a massive back and forth here, as I mentioned earlier, on Taiwan. And I think this is an issue where I agree with negative that it is important that China, they do something with Taiwan. But I think AF is very reasonable to say they can just lie in the media, manipulate things, tell the history and the stories they want to in order to achieve, to get away with whatever they want to do with Taiwan in terms of not having to take action as a result of this. So I don't think that this is going to be the thing that is likely to be significantly the change in how they want to operate around Taiwan. Because if they wanted to invade, they already could. If they didn't want to, if they don't want to invade on both sides of the military, they can already twist and lie their way around it to not have that domestic impact around around Taiwan. Where I think it becomes more of a clash in the debate is around the smaller sort of impacts that China can have, can it be more likely to escalate its soft power, is it more likely to use the BRI, economic bullying, etc., or deal with disputes. I think what Neg's able to point out is that all the defence mechanisms that ACT points to its reasons why this will curtail China's behaviour on this level of action would never actually trigger the responses from the rest of the pact, which means it becomes quite toothless in that sense. I think we needed more from ACT to explain what would if it's not just there's a skirmish in South China Sea, if America doesn't send in the fleet, what they do instead that then prevents China from doing this beyond just having support around. It's a bit unclear what that support or large body around them actually does in this. So at that point then, a lot of China's behaviour, given China knows it can get away with this, as Neg points out, it's unlikely, it doesn't seem like this body can do a whole lot to mitigate China's actions on that level of behaviour either, which means they still get away with all the things they're doing. So at that point, I think China's response the stuff in economics come at this point in a moment, but militarily doesn't change a whole lot. So the last thing then, building off that, is what is the economic harms and benefits likely to be to these other countries that join or don't join. So I think the first big thing we come from AF here is these countries are likely to gain a lot of benefits from being part of the Quad. I think for a large part this is a bit of an asserted link. They'll suddenly have access to massive economic aid and they'll have massive military bases and all this sort of stuff. I think more needs done on why that is likely to occur and what it looks like. The best mechanism we get is these countries are likely to be interested in stability. The big four Quad countries want stability in the region, so that's why they're likely to act in this way. I think there's a number of responses from negative though that would sort of mitigate the benefits of this, both in the short going into the longer term, and then where this links into then the responses to China, showing how their economic responses and targeting is actually going to create a more tangible harm than it does a tangible benefit for these countries. So the first thing they say is it's likely to take a lot of time. When I say take time, I'm not super convinced on this whole, there'll be a time delay between the deal being announced and signed, and that's when they'll be actioning. So I don't think that sort of flies. I think that the taking time aspect, I think that does make sense from negative, is the idea that just it takes time to rejig economies and trade routes, etc., to like completely re-gear your economy to change to different trading partners. So there's a harm in that short term there. Secondly, it is often quite big changes, and that takes a big hit to the economy when you're trying to move all of your trade around, given how powerful China is in the region. Thirdly, you're likely to suffer sanctions and loss of foreign aid from China in the meantime, which creates a significant harm to the smaller countries who are likely to sign up, who would otherwise sign up. And lastly, it's just like it's unclear that the West or the USA can just replicate all of this trade and benefit and foreign aid, or is likely to replicate it or do it in any way. And when we get, and the capacity of China to engage in that trade war seems like they have more to be able to sustain that. So they're able to, given the size of the economy, given the ideological desire they have, they can hold out longer. I think we'll do examples of other times where China has held out trade wars, etc., which means that it is less likely to suffer the consequences of those harms of the economic trade and cut off versus what these smaller countries in the region are in the first place. And that, I think, then has the flow-on impacts, and some of those countries may not want to join or may pull out of the Quad as a consequence of this and just go back to China, and it's unclear that that isn't a particular benefit then. So at the end of the debate then, what we've got is a situation where the threat of China engaging in a militaristic, threatening way is pretty low at the moment. Then the fact then that this Quad provides very minimal change to the military risk factor, but also because it won't be enacted in lots of cases, doesn't provide any change to the non-significant military action, and there presents some economic harms to countries who are signing up to this, which will be more harmful than the status quo. Mega's able to win the debate. Hope that all made sense. Thank you very much again for the debate. Any questions or any feedback, please come and see me. Otherwise, well done.